Have you ever felt abandoned? Completely and utterly forgotten by everyone, even God. The year was 1014 BC. A young man huddled in the darkness of a cave, his breath shallow, his body tense with every sound that might signal the approach of those hunting him. This wasn't just any fugitive, this was David, the anointed future king of Israel, running for his life from King Saul. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, a question burned in his heart. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? What would you do if you found yourself in what seemed like an endless season of suffering? Where would your mind go? How would you pray? You might be surprised to learn that even the most revered biblical figures struggled with these exact feelings of divine abandonment. In fact, the prayer that emerged from David's anguish would become one of the most honest and transformative expressions of faith ever recorded. Psalm 13. The story of this psalm reaches across 3,000 years to touch our deepest human experiences. Today, we're exploring how a mere 6 verses written in desperation became a universal language for the human soul in distress. This is the journey of Psalm 13, from lament to hope, from accusation to praise, from darkness to light. In ancient Jerusalem, around 970 BC, a now enthroned King David stood before the collected scrolls of Israel's sacred poetry. Among them was a short prayer he had composed years earlier during his darkest hour. Little did he know that this brief lament would resonate through the centuries, speaking to people in their moments of deepest despair across continents and millennia. But what makes Psalm 13 so uniquely powerful? Why has it endured when countless other ancient texts have been lost to history? The answer lies in its brutal honesty and its remarkable journey from despair to hope in just 6 verses. When we examine this psalm closely, we discover it isn't just a prayer, it's a roadmap for the human soul in crisis. It shows us that authentic faith doesn't mean suppressing doubt or pain, it means bringing our raw emotions directly to God. As theologian Walter Brueggemann noted in his landmark 1984 work, The Message of the Psalms, this psalm exemplifies what he called the painful, dangerous, subversive transit from orientation through disorientation to new orientation. Imagine yourself in ancient Israel for a moment. The year is approximately 1010 BC. The landscape is rugged, harsh, and unforgiving. David, a shepherd turned warrior, turned fugitive, has been running from King Saul's jealous rage for years. Each day brings new dangers, new betrayals, new reasons to question whether God's promise to make him king would ever come true. In some desolate hiding place, perhaps a cave in the wilderness of En-Gedi, or a remote forest in the hill country, David reaches his breaking point. With trembling hands, feeling utterly abandoned, he takes out his writing materials and begins to pour out his heart in what scholars believe is one of the most authentic expressions of spiritual crisis in ancient literature. This is not the composed, confident king we often imagine. This is a man at the end of his rope, crying out to a God who seems silent. The psalm opens with a barrage of anguish questions for how longs that build upon each other with increasing intensity. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day of sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Each question reveals a deeper layer of David's suffering. First, the perception that God has forgotten him, not just temporarily, but forever. Then, the painful sense that God is deliberately hiding, turning away. Third, the internal torment, the exhausting mental struggle, the daily heaviness of heart. And finally, the external threat enemies gaining ground while divine help seems absent. Biblical scholars point out that this fourfold repetition of "how long" is not just poetic style, it's an ancient Near Eastern convention found in Mesopotamian prayers dating back to the Akkadian Empire around 2350 BCE. The repeated phrase was understood as a formal way to express unbearable suffering. In David's time, this would have been recognized as the language of extreme lament. What's remarkable here is that David directs these questions directly to God. He doesn't just complain about God, he complains to God. There's an intimacy in his protest, a relationship that persists even in the midst of perceived abandonment. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel observed in his 1962 work, The Prophets, this kind of direct confrontation with God is uniquely characteristic of the Hebrew tradition, a tradition that valued honest dialogue with the divine over detached reverence. The psychological journey of Psalm 13 contains wisdom that modern mental health professionals would recognize. Dr. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at New York University, has written extensively about the therapeutic value of naming our emotions. In his 2006 book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he notes that acknowledging negative feelings rather than suppressing them is essential for emotional processing. When David explicitly names his feelings of abandonment, his mental wrestling, and his sorrow, he's engaging in what today might be called emotional honesty, a crucial first step toward healing. After the barrage of questions comes a desperate plea in verses 3 and 4. "Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall." Notice the shift here from questioning to commanding. David doesn't just ask God to remember him. He demands it. Look, answer, give light. This boldness might seem presumptuous, but biblical scholars note that it's consistent with the covenant relationship Israel understood itself to have with God. This wasn't mere reverence, but reflected the profound trust that God was bound by covenant promises and could be called to account. The phrase, "give light to my eyes," carries special significance in ancient Hebrew thought. In the world of 1000 BC, light was more than just illumination. It represented life, understanding, and divine presence. When eyes lost their light, it signaled approaching death. Archaeological findings from ancient Israel, such as oil lamps discovered in tombs dating to this period, highlight how central this metaphor of light was to their understanding of life and death. When David says, "Or I will sleep in death," he's expressing both physical and spiritual concerns. King Saul was actively seeking to kill him, but there was more at stake than physical life. In ancient Near Eastern theology, death meant separation from God's presence. The Hebrew concept of Sheol, the shadowy realm of the dead, was understood as a place where praise of God ceased. For a man like David, whose identity was wrapped up in his relationship with God, this spiritual separation was as terrifying as physical death. There's also a concern for God's reputation here. If David falls, he argues, God's enemies will claim victory. This isn't just self-preservation. It's an appeal to God's own interests. Ancient Near Eastern religion was deeply concerned with divine honor. When the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in approximately 1050 BCE, for example, their victory was seen as a triumph of their god Dagon over Israel's God. David taps into this theological framework, essentially saying, "If I fall, your enemies will claim you failed." But then something remarkable happens in this psalm. In verse 5, without any explanation, without any apparent answer from God, there's a dramatic turn. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. This pivot is so abrupt that some scholars have questioned whether these verses were added later. However, most biblical experts see this sudden shift as the authentic core of the Psalm's message. What we're witnessing is faith asserting itself in the absence of evidence. Professor N.T. Wright of the University of St. Andrews has described this phenomenon as the defiant nevertheless of faith, the choice to trust despite circumstances. The Hebrew word translated as unfailing love is hesed, one of the richest terms in the biblical vocabulary. It refers to God's steadfast, covenant-faithful love that persists regardless of human faithfulness. This concept was central to Israel's understanding of God following the covenant established with Moses at Mount Sinai around 1446 BC. By invoking God's ease, David is reminding himself of the historical pattern of God's faithfulness to Israel, even when that faithfulness wasn't immediately apparent. The psalm concludes with what seems like an impossible statement given David's circumstances. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Notice the tense here. It's as if the salvation has already happened, even though nothing in David's external circumstances has changed. He's still in hiding, still in danger, still waiting for God's intervention. Yet he speaks of God's goodness in the past tense. He has been good to me. This psychological phenomenon, choosing gratitude and praise before deliverance, arrives aligns with what modern positive psychology identifies as a powerful practice for building resilience. Dr. Robert Emmons, a leading scientific expert on gratitude from the University of California, Davis, has demonstrated through extensive research since 2000 that the practice of gratitude can improve mental health even in difficult circumstances. David's choice to end with praise wasn't just spiritual, it was psychologically transformative. The historical context of this psalm gives us even deeper insight into its power. Scholars place its composition during David's years as a fugitive from King Saul, approximately between 1020 to 1010 BCE. These were formative years for Israel's future king. After being anointed by the prophet Samuel around 1025 BCE, David had experienced a meteoric rise in Saul's court, followed by an equally dramatic fall from favor. The man who had once been celebrated in songs for slaying tens of thousands found himself fleeing for his life, hiding in caves, feigning madness among enemies, and gathering a band of fellow outcasts. Archaeological discoveries help us understand the physical environment of David's flight. Excavations at sites like the Cave of Adullam, identified as one of David's hideouts, reveal harsh living conditions, narrow, damp spaces with little natural light, hardly conducive to maintaining optimism. The wilderness of Judah, another area where David sought refuge, is one of the most inhospitable regions in Israel, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit 38 degrees Celsius and minimal water sources. Yet it was in these extreme circumstances that David composed not just Psalm 13, but many other psalms that would later comfort millions in their own times of distress. The historical evidence suggests that David's greatest contributions to spiritual literature emerged not from his throne room, but from his hiding places. When we trace the journey of Psalm 13 through history, we find that it gained special significance during times of collective suffering. During the Babylonian exile, 586 to 538 BC, when the Jewish people were forcibly removed from their homeland, psalms of lament like this one took on new meaning. Archaeological findings from this period show an increase in personal seal inscriptions with phrases from the Psalms, suggesting people clung to these words during their national crisis. In the early Christian era, around 64 to 313 CE, when followers of Jesus faced intense persecution under various Roman emperors, the catacomb inscriptions reveal that Psalm 13's language became a way to express both suffering and hope. Early Christian commentators, like Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, wrote extensively on this psalm, seeing in it a pattern for the spiritual life from darkness to light, doubt to faith. During the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945, Jewish prisoners in concentration camps reported reciting the Psalms, including Psalm 13, as a way to maintain spiritual resistance. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, noted in his 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, that those who maintain some form of spiritual life, often through prayer and scripture, showed greater resilience even in those horrific circumstances. What makes Psalm 13 especially remarkable is its emotional authenticity. Unlike many religious texts that present idealized faith, this psalm acknowledges the reality of spiritual darkness. It gives voice to the questions we often fear to ask. Where is God in my suffering? Has He forgotten me? How long must this continue? Psychologically, this kind of honesty serves a crucial function. Dr. Breen Brown, research professor at the University of Houston, has demonstrated through her studies since 2010 that acknowledging vulnerability rather than suppressing it leads to greater emotional health. When we name our doubts and fears, as David did, we begin to diffuse their power over us. The structure of Psalm 13 reveals an intentional progression. Biblical scholars typically divide it into three parts: the lament, verses 1 to 2, the petition, verses 3 to 4, and the expression of trust, verses 5 to 6. This movement from complaint to confidence isn't random. It represents a time-tested spiritual pathway. It acknowledges that faith doesn't mean bypassing negative emotions, but rather moving through them toward trust. Professor Walter Brueggemann describes this pattern as psalms of disorientation that move toward reorientation. In his analysis, these psalms serve as guides for navigating spiritual crisis. The journey isn't instant or magical. It requires honest expression of pain, direct petition for help, and a willful choice to remember God's faithfulness despite present circumstances. Let's look more closely at the psychological journey David takes us through. In verses 1 to 2, he names 4 specific aspects of his suffering: feeling forgotten by God, sensing God's face is hidden, wrestling with anxious thoughts, and watching enemies gain advantage. By articulating these painful realities, David models what psychologists call emotional literacy, the ability to identify and express specific emotions rather than being overwhelmed by vague distress. In verses 3 to 4, David makes specific requests for God to look at him, answer him, and restore his strength, give light to his eyes. This act of petitioning represents what psychologists would identify as agency, taking action rather than remaining passive in suffering. Even though David can't change his external circumstances, he can actively engage with God about them. Finally, in verses 5 to 6, David makes a crucial cognitive shift. He chooses to focus on God's character, unfailing love, rather than his own circumstances. This exemplifies what cognitive behavioral therapy identifies as cognitive reframing, changing focus from what we can't control to what remains constant. For David, God's covenant love was the unchanging reality that transcended his temporary circumstances. What's particularly fascinating about this psalm is that we never learn exactly how or when God answered David. The historical record tells us that eventually, around 1010 BC, Saul died in battle against the Philistines, and David's long wait to assume the throne ended. But the psalm itself doesn't narrate any divine intervention. Its power lies in showing us how faith can reorient itself even before circumstances change. This internal transformation is what makes Psalm 13 so universally applicable. Whether facing illness, grief, financial hardship, relationship breakdown, or any other form of suffering, the psalm offers a framework for honest spiritual engagement. It validates feelings of abandonment while refusing to let those feelings have the final word. Looking at how this psalm has been used therapeutically in modern contexts provides additional insight. Since the development of biblical counseling as a formal approach in the 1970s, many therapists have used Psalm 13 as a template for helping people process grief and loss. Dr. Dan Allender, professor of counseling psychology at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, has written extensively about how the Psalms of Lament provide language for trauma survivors who struggle to articulate their pain. The theological implications of Psalm 13 are profound. It presents a God who can handle our questions, accusations, and demands a God who doesn't require polite, sanitized prayers. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, wrote in his 2002 book, The Dignity of Difference, that the Hebrew Bible's willingness to include such raw expressions of doubt and protest is one of its most distinctive and valuable features. For those struggling with doubt or feeling distant from God, Psalm 13 offers a counterintuitive message. Bringing your doubts directly to God can be an act of profound faith. Far from being evidence of spiritual failure, questioning God can be a step toward deeper relationship. As theologian C.S. Lewis wrote following the death of his wife in 1960, "The crying to God against God is evidence for God." The very act of questioning assumes someone is listening. When we consider the brevity of this psalm, just 6 verses that can be read aloud in less than a minute, its impact is even more remarkable. In approximately 107 words, in Hebrew, David captures the entire spectrum of spiritual experience from desolation to confidence. This economy of expression makes it accessible even to those whose suffering has left them without energy for lengthy prayer or reflection. The journey of Psalm 13 from David's personal prayer to sacred scripture involves another interesting historical dimension. Scholars believe the collection and arrangement of the Psalms into the form we know today occurred during the period of the Second Temple, approximately 516 BC to 70 CE. During this time, what had begun as personal prayers became communal liturgy, used in public worship. This transformation from private lament to communal resource speaks to a key aspect of spiritual resilience, the value of shared language for suffering. When we lack words for our pain, the Psalms offer vocabulary. When we feel alone in our questioning, these ancient texts remind us that others have walked this path before us. As theologian Kathleen O'Connor noted in her 2002 work, Lamentations and the Tears of the World, shared language for suffering creates solidarity across time and space. The musical aspect of Psalm 13 shouldn't be overlooked. The heading in many Bible translations notes that this was for the director of music, indicating it was meant to be sung. Music has a unique capacity to express emotion that transcends cognitive understanding. Neuroscientific research since the early 2000s has demonstrated that music activates multiple brain regions simultaneously, creating powerful emotional responses. When ancient Israelites sang this psalm, they weren't just reciting words, they were engaging in a multisensory expression of their spiritual journey. Archaeological discoveries of ancient musical instruments in Israel, including lyres and frame drums dating to the Iron Age, 1200 to 586 BCE, help us imagine how this psalm might have sounded when first performed. The emotional power of music would have amplified the psalm's message, helping worshipers move through the emotional journey from lament to praise. For contemporary audiences, Psalm 13 offers several practical applications. First, it provides permission for honest spiritual expression. Many people of faith feel pressure to maintain a positive facade, to have enough faith, to bypass negative emotions. This psalm counters that pressure with a model of authentic engagement that includes questioning, demanding, and lamenting. Second, it offers a structured pathway through spiritual crisis. By moving from lament to petition to trust, it creates a template that can be followed even when one's own prayer life feels directionless. Mental health professionals often note that having a process to follow during emotional distress provides a crucial sense of agency when circumstances feel overwhelming. Third, it demonstrates the therapeutic value of choosing praise before deliverance arrives. By ending with trust and singing despite unchanged circumstances, David models what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the capacity to find meaning and even flourishing in the midst of continuing hardship. For those who work with people in crisis, chaplains, counselors, healthcare providers, Psalm 13 provides language that honors suffering without ending there. Unlike empty platitudes that dismiss pain too quickly, this psalm acknowledges the reality of feeling forgotten by God while still moving toward hope. This balance makes it particularly valuable in contexts like hospital chaplaincy, grief counseling, and trauma recovery. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable psalm, it's worth noting that David's experience of divine absence was temporary. Historical records indicate that he eventually became king around 1010 BCE and reigned for approximately 40 years, establishing Israel as a powerful united kingdom. The man who once hid in caves would go on to capture Jerusalem and make it his capital around 1003 BCE. Yet even in his royal years, David never forgot the lessons of the wilderness. The Psalms attributed to him continue to express this pattern of honest engagement with God through all life circumstances. In Psalm 30 verse 5, written later in his life, he would reflect, "Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning." The spiritual resilience forged in his years of waiting and questioning sustained him through the complexities of leadership and the personal failures that would later mark his reign. The enduring power of Psalm 13 lies in its ability to speak across cultures, centuries, and individual circumstances. Whether facing global pandemic, personal loss, mental health challenges, or spiritual doubt, countless people have found their own experience reflected in these ancient words. They've discovered that naming abandonment can be the first step toward reconnection, that questioning God can be an expression of relationship rather than rejection. So the next time you find yourself asking, "How long, O Lord?" the next time divine absence feels more real than divine presence, remember that you stand in a long tradition of faithful questioning. Remember that the path from lament to praise isn't a straight line, but often a winding journey. Remember that sometimes trust is a choice made before feelings follow. In the ancient words of this shepherd-turned-king, written in darkness but reaching toward light, we find a timeless invitation to bring our whole selves questions, accusations, fears, and eventually trust before the God who can handle our honest hearts. How long? We may not know. But like David, we can choose to sing while we wait for the answer. Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, and remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.